Welcome to another episode of Ceramics with Sheriff. Today we're going to cover the wonderful world of decorative techniques. So there are tons of different ones we can do. We're going to cover like 8 to 10 of them. I'm going to go over them really briefly, but it's just a general view of different decorative techniques you can use on your pots or your ceramic pieces to add detail, visual interest, or just change the general shape of a pot. One could make a mug that could be simple, straight walls. But what could you do to your mug or your piece to differentiate it from others? So that's what we're going to cover today, and we're going to go through a couple different ways where you can add visual interest through adding details and designs that's not just carving or incising. So the first one I'm going to go over is slip trailing, and we're going to do this quick just as a review or a refresher or a lesson to everyone to kind of get a little experience with everything. So this is the only one I need bone dry clay. The clay is dry, it's a finished piece, it has not been fired in a kiln, but the reason we do this is because this will suck up all the moisture from the slip we're drawing on with. So I'm using underglaze, but same difference, you can use slip. But essentially, with my piece, I just use the slip to draw lines. And what that's going to end up doing is it's going to create three-dimensional texture or lines on the piece. I could do dots. So it's cool because you can get pretty creative with it. And it's just like drawing and it goes quickly. I'm doing this pretty sloppy just for time. But you can see that. And I did this maybe a minute ago. And you can see how dry some of the underglaze is already. And the benefit of that is our slip's not dripping when we draw. So the dry clay of the bone dry clay allows us to draw on it and our lines to stay put where we put them. So this is a fun one and can lead to some really cool results, especially mixed with other decoration techniques. All right, our next technique is underglaze. So underglaze comes in a little jar or a big one, but they're basically liquid clay. So they're like slip with pigment added to them. So what that does is it allows us to paint on colors while the clay is bone dry, leather hard before it's been fired. And it allows us to paint in a way that's more like a painting other than a glaze would. So you can blend them together, you can mix them together. You do have to do 3 coats of them or 2 really heavy ones. But what it allows us to work with is it allows us to create something very much like a painting. So I can use this as a decoration technique to almost make a painting or make something more vivid and beautiful on my ceramic piece. The colors will brighten if I put a clear glaze on them, which will make them safe for food as well. If they're on the outside, you don't have to. So another example of what I can do with it is just for decoration. So I have an ombre here, greenware, unfired, so it's still not that bright. When it's fired, you can see how the colors really brighten up. This still doesn't have clear on it. If I put clear, it would be even brighter. Then lastly, something else I can do, if I paint my underglaze on while it's leather hard, so the clay is still somewhat soft, I can carve through it, which leads us to our next one called sgraffito. So sgraffito is using underglaze and then carving through it to allow the lines I carve through to contrast. So, example, I'm using a dark clay. If you guys are using a white ones, your lines would show up white. But I painted this with underglaze, and then I took my needle tool and my carving tool, and I carved these lines out. And what that does is reveal the color of my clay as my lines. So you have the nice bright background. And I still haven't wiped the boogers off this, but it allows us to get that cool, detailed line drawing look with a nice bright color on the back. So underglaze, you can use in many ways. Those are my favorite. We have sgraffito and painting. So another really cool effect we can get is with something called inlay. It's a little bit adapted from the traditional way of doing it, but what I would do is carve or incise a design onto my clay, fire it, and then I'll paint all over my carving or incising. And what's gonna happen is I'm gonna take a clean sponge and I'm gonna wipe that away, and my design is only gonna stay in the cracks. So if you look here, I already wiped some away. Everywhere I carved or incised, that underglaze stuck into, and now those lines are gonna show up green. So you just have to make sure you have clean water. Mine's a little dirty because I started, and a clean sponge, and you get it pretty wet, squeeze most of the water out, and then I'll just wipe. And I kind of put a lot of pressure and squeeze against it. And every time I take the sponge off, I'm gonna clean it. Make sure I wipe it really good so none of that green underglaze gets stuck anywhere else or whatever color you're using. And then my result. So this is a really neat post-firing one. It's called inlay. You can do it in carving, you can do it in incising. You just need to make sure that your lines are deep enough so that that underglaze will stay in it. So I would like to address the difference between carving and incising. Carving is where you're removing clay from the surface. So I'm pulling clay away. Incising is kind of, if you think of like a doctor or a surgeon, they're cutting in. So an incision is cutting in, so incising is cutting into the surface. So this example is an incising. So basically I cut into the surface of the clay and made lines, but I didn't remove anything. So incising and carving work really cool with a clear glaze because it pulls into all my carvings or incisions and it adds details to it. So this was on a white clay with just a clear pink. So before I ruin the shape of this with impressing, incising can be done with something pointy, needle tool. The trick with it is not holding the sharp blade or the sharp needle straight against the surface, because then I'll get sharp pieces that come off with it. I call them boogers. So holding it at an angle and kind of pulling it through allows me to get nice clean lines that I don't have to mess with later. So if I just want to draw simple lines on a surface, incising is one of the best methods. So I'll do this upside down so you can see. Just kind of drawing some abstract shapes just to get the idea across quick. And then I can do Mishima, or I can use these for sgraffito lines later and underglaze over them. So incising is just cutting into the surface. Carving, on the other hand, is using a tool. Now this is a really tiny one. I like it for sgraffito. But you can see how it has a little loop. It's like a little baby loop tool. But what this will do, and I'm just gonna make stripes down, I'll push it in and pull it through. And you can see it removes clay when I do that. So it's great for adding deeper lines or texture. I wasn't paying attention there. Or I can use a little bit bigger one, so this is still a tiny one. But it allows me to add visual texture through creating depth on the surface, so you can see all the little pieces coming off. So I can do some cool designs with carving. So carving is deeper, incising is just those little lines. And now the last one I want to go over is impress. And this one really isn't used a lot, but can create some really cool results. So you can make stamps on your own with clay, allow them to dry, push them into the clay. The clay has to be super soft for this to work. So I grabbed a couple things, just random things around the house that I thought would look cool for stamps. So I have this little rolly thing. It has a texture on it. You probably can't see it, but grabbed, and these two lids from cologne bottles. So I thought they'd look cool if I pressed them in. The last one I did, you can see how I got that cool texture from pushing in. The challenge with it is it will deform the shape, so you have to kind of hold on to it while you do it from the other side. So here we go. This is already dry because I was force drying it, but basically I just push into the surface of the clay with whatever I chose. So I'm just making little triangles. And if I did this across the whole clay surface while it was soft, it'd be a really cool texture for a cup. So you can see how I got that little triangle texture. Let's try it here, see if it's more soft. So it allows us to have texture and to push something in. So you guys can custom make stamps to push in. My clay, this is already bone dry over here because I had it in front of the heater. I don't know if this will work, but so this has texture on it. So I'm gonna try to roll it here. So I'm just gonna roll it. Oh yeah, it worked. So you see how that added like a cool little texture to it, kind of like I used the scoring rib. Anyway, those are 3 techniques that we can use, and we use them in a lot of other ways too, but I can use them in sgraffito, I can use them in inlay. Basically, they're really, really common techniques, but they also allow us to create visual texture, interest on our pots. This thing's ugly, so. Worry about that later. So, I did the whole thing and I wasn't recording. Piercing. So, just like piercing an ear, you're poking a hole through it. So there's not a ton of uses for this. It's mostly for purely decorative pieces, maybe a strainer, maybe a luminary if I want to put a candle in and have the light shine out of the shapes. But simple way to do it is a drill bit because it's used for removing stuff. So I can just simply push it there, twist it in just like a drill would do, and it removes the pieces and gives me a nice clean hole there. Secondarily, I would use an X-Acto knife if I want to cut out finer shapes like I did here. So you want the clay really leather hard for this so it's nice and firm. The trick to this is pushing the knife through and then pulling. So you don't want to saw because it'll give you jagged lines. So I'm just going to pull this sideways and stop. And then if I want to make another line, so let's say I want to do a square, push in, pull down, push in, pull down, push in, pull sideways. And it gives you a really, really nice clean line that I could smooth that out then. And that is piercing. So I'm gonna cover wax and tape resist, and these are really cool. A lot of times people will put wax on their bottoms so that the glaze doesn't stick when they dip it in, which is great. Wax comes in bottles like this. It's liquid. The tricky part is on your bisqueware, if you accidentally get wax on your finger and touch something, you're never gonna get the glaze to stick to it, and then you have a poopy piece. This is an example of where I did impress. So I impressed the skull on there and then I did inlay, but I didn't want any of this glaze to get on there. So I waxed this whole thing. And then when I glazed over it, none of the glaze would stick to it. So it still stayed like that. Another example, so using tape, you can make shapes, do whatever you want. You can leave the clay raw. So here I taped a triangle while it was bisqueware, underglazed it, and then I waxed over it while the tape was still there to make sure not to get any on here. Pulled the tape off, and then when I dunked it in my glaze, I was left with no glaze on my triangle. Lastly, there's tons of other ways you can do it. You can use them together. These were both, this was tape and wax like the other one, and then this one was just tape. All right, to conclude our session from today, Lexi's joined us. So, we've gone over a bunch of different decoration techniques for clay. Underglaze is one of the main things we use because we can decorate, we can paint, we can add it into carving, we can add it into incising. It's a great resource for color, visual interest through color. We also did sgraffito, which is underglazing and carving or incising through. Carving's removing clay, incising is cutting into the surface of clay. We did slip trailing to create 3D lines. We did impressing, which is stamping into the surface. Piercing, which is cutting into the surface. Wax and tape resist, which is using wax and tape to prevent glaze from sticking somewhere. And that pretty much wraps it in. We did inlay, where we're rubbing underglaze into our carvings and drawings. We want to use these in our projects to kind of add a little more visual interest to them and make them have a little extra pop and wow. And we'll end our session with this piece I made today. Goodbye, Lexi. So here's this beautiful piece we made today. I'm out. So dude joined us. He said, don't forget to hit that like. Just kidding.